Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Eleanor and I spoke with Simon Robinson, who is Global Managing Editor at Thomson Reuters.
Simon spoke about reporting on the fall of Baghdad in Iraq 2003. He talked about feeling responsible for reporters in sticky situations out in the field, and he talked about what young reporters are asking from newsrooms today.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Great. Well, Simon, really excellent to have you on the podcast. Thanks for finding time very early on a Thursday morning. I wanted to start really with a kind of conceptual question of what is a newswire. You know, for some of our listeners will be very familiar with it. Some will be much less so. So could you kind of explain, you know, both in the context of Reuters, but more generally how it works?
A newswire, I think, is a journalistic enterprise that collects news, reports on news around the world, and provides it to a number of customers. Often we're essentially a B2B business, a business-to-business business. So we're providing, on the one hand, a little bit like, say, the Associated Press, a news service to the world's other media organizations. So that's television stations, digital news websites, newspapers. And then on the other hand, we kind of compete with Bloomberg, which, obviously provides a lot of information in real time to the financial customers. So that's traders, bankers, people like that. So we kind of span both. I think that what a newswire is exactly is changing a lot and has changed certainly over the last decade. I think that traditionally the job of a newswire was to cover breaking news. It was kind of the first responder, as it were, when a news story broke. And I think now, in some ways, all of the newswires are trying to do many more things for many more people. And that's kind of both exciting and a real challenge.
What are those things?
Well, one of the things we've done over the last few years in particular is we've done a number of new things. We've started to do more of our own kind of consumer journalism directed at directly to consumers rather than to other media organizations. We have added a big data team to do data journalism, which is true of many of our customers as well, especially places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, BBC. We do a lot more graphics than we used to. We have begun to get into, over the last kind of 8-9 years, a lot more investigative journalism. In fact, I spent a few years working on our enterprise unit, enterprise being an American journalistic term for kind of any initiative story that's not directly news. And so we've done long investigations. We're doing lots of different things. We now provide raw material for podcasts, for instance. So we have started doing some of our own podcasts, mostly out of New York. But then we also see that there's an opportunity to provide material for other people's podcasts as well. So.
And could you tell us a little bit about, the history of Reuters as an organization, and also, the others, so AP, AFP, like where did these organizations come from originally?
Well, Reuters began
with the telegraph, with the pigeons, or something.
Famously with the pigeons. So there was a German guy who is affectionately known still at Reuters, the Baron, because at some point he was made a Baron, von Reuter. And he saw an opportunity originally on financial news, or on financial information, I guess. He spotted an opportunity to provide the closing numbers from different markets around Europe. This is way back 2 centuries ago now, about 170 years. To provide it in other centers, so that if he was the first to get the numbers from Paris to Amsterdam, say, then that would give the people in Amsterdam, the people in the market, an opportunity to essentially to make money. So that's the way it began. And one of the early ways that they would relay the information was via pigeon.
You began your career in Australia in the kind of Australian equivalent of People magazine, right? So it's a pretty major career change.
Yeah, I think a lot of journalists change and switch the type of journalism they're doing. So I did start. I studied film making at university, and it was the early 1990s. And I think that in Australia there was actually a bit of a renaissance of film. That Muriel's Wedding, Strictly Ballroom, films like this were doing very well globally. But nevertheless, I kind of looked around and thought, well, I could probably work on a film set for 10 years voluntarily and not get paid. This is probably not going to be financially that viable. So I jumped into journalism, and I worked at the Australian equivalent. It was a startup actually that Time Inc. started, the equivalent of People magazine, for a couple of years as a fact checker, which is something lots of American magazines in particular used to have, and some still do, but fewer and fewer.
And then what was your own journalistic progression from there to foreign correspondency for Time? How did you make that move?
So I, like a lot of Australians, left Australia to backpack around for a while and spent a year mostly in South America and then in Eastern Europe in the mid-90s. I think that Australia is so far from everywhere that when you leave, you kind of tend to stay a long time. After about a year, my old boss, the editor at Who Weekly, which was the equivalent of People, had moved across to Time Australia. In those days, Time magazine had various regional editions, and he encouraged me to come back. So I came back to Australia, and I started working for Time, both in Australia and then in New Zealand, in all for about 3 or 4 years. And then I moved to Nairobi. I did not know Africa that well. It was early 1999, and it was about 6 months after Al-Qaeda had bombed 2 embassies, one in Nairobi and one in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And I think there was a feeling that that Time, which had kind of pulled out of Africa in a little way, realized, well, actually we need people on the ground more than we thought. And so then I was in Nairobi for 4 years.
And you wanted to go and report there, or was that wasn't a choice?
No, I absolutely wanted to go. Yeah, I really wanted to do something different, and this was an opportunity that came up. So,
what's the kind of memory that sticks with you from that time?
I was on the road a lot, probably around 60% of the time. It was an incredibly interesting time. There was conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. There was conflict in Sierra Leone. There was conflict in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. There was, I guess, the ongoing HIV/AIDS story, which actually, as a journalist, it increasingly was difficult to tell in any kind of novel way because until the early 2000s, and then it really became a story, especially in South Africa, around antiretrovirals and whether people would get access to these incredible drugs that prolong life. But also I think that Africa was really becoming an economic story, which I think it still is. In many ways, the best way to tell the story of Africa these days is economic. It's this incredibly complex, more than 50 countries, each with just as in any part of the world, each with its own dynamic and own politics. And I just found Africa endlessly fascinating, interesting. The longer I was there, the more I realized I didn't really understand it, because to understand something so complex is really difficult, and I miss it dearly all the time.
And when you were there, where were you where was the sort of broader story of what was happening with Time magazine, and also the kind of technology and methods of journalism? So did you have a sat phone and things by that stage? How were you filing? I mean, when we had foreign correspondents from an early era, people like Max Hastings, they talked about the enormous difficulty just of getting the story back. Had that changed by that time?
It was it was definitely beginning to change. I would say that when I first arrived in very early 99, I had a sat phone. It was pretty rudimentary, I've got to say. it was definitely still a case that one of the hardest challenges was logistical, getting anywhere. Once you got somewhere, there were always stories. So it wasn't often a journalistic challenge, it was a logistical challenge getting around. But, obviously the internet existed then, and more and more you could find somewhere. At the least you could find a kind of an internet cafe somewhere from which to file your stories. In the big change, I think, for Time and for many organizations around that time was, certainly in the early and into the mid-2000s, was this shift. I guess I was right at the end of this incredible period when a lot of my colleagues and other correspondents and competitors had to file every day or every other day, and I had the luxury of filing for a weekly magazine, which was, if there was a big news story, and depending on when in the week it happened, I could have a few days to report it, and then, would file my kind of one story. And then, of course, what happened was, because of the web, we relatively quickly, certainly by the mid-2000s, where Time.com was demanding kind of daily stuff often. So that was the really big shift.
You told us in advance of the interview that one of your most important stories for Time was your story about the fall of Baghdad in 2003, and obviously you were there. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I was an embedded journalist, so for anyone who kind of wasn't following journalism in 2003 when Iraq happened, the embedded journalists were this concept the American military came up with of kind of officially bringing in journalists to essentially attach themselves to units that they would then move with as the invasion unfolded. So I was with a battalion, a U.S. Marine battalion, and it ended up it got to Baghdad on April, the outskirts of Baghdad on April 7th, and then into central Baghdad on April 9th, and that was the day that the statue was pulled down, and by the unit that I happened to be embedded with. It was a unit that saw a lot of conflict a lot of action during the invasion. I think it was 21 days from the launch of the invasion to the statue coming down, and there were there were hostilities that this unit had on about probably 7 or 8 of those days, which is actually pretty high. And so it was terrifying and fascinating. It was really, as an embedded journalist, you were in this kind of bubble. You could really only see what you could see to the horizon. That was your worldview. And comms were a real issue during that conflict as well. So, your general understanding of what was happening more broadly was somewhat limited. It was slightly strange. When I got to Baghdad, I kind of disembedded myself the day after the statue fell, and then I ended up staying through most of that year, which was...
And what do you think, looking back 16 years on, of the kind of tenor of the coverage from that time, not just your own, but more generally? I mean, the big images, Bush with the mission accomplished idea, and this idea that this was the end of a war rather than the beginning. Do you think that the press in general got that right, or was there a premature sense that a chapter had closed?
I think by the time Bush appeared on that, I think it was an aircraft carrier with that sign behind him, it was... I don't think that was the problem time. I think the problem time, or the time when the press probably got it more wrong, if I'm honest, was earlier. By that point, I think that it was pretty clear that Iraq was starting to unravel. And so, which is why that sign seemed so kind of, misplaced, or it really stood against what was happening in Baghdad. In fact, at that time, I remember in the middle of 2003, Time ran a cover which essentially, said that Iraq was unraveling, and which I helped report it along with a few other reporters. And both the Americans in Baghdad, who were running Iraq essentially, and back in Washington, were really critical of us for doing that. but it was very clear by that point. I think the problem was earlier, which was in the lead up to the invasion, that there, with some good exceptions, but that there was too much, taking leaks directly from the administration to bolster their case for an invasion.
And when the statue fell, how accurate did you think the reporting of that moment was compared to the actual mood in the square? Because obviously there was a lot of reports saying that it almost felt staged, that the more people were there than there really were in the pit photos, that the guy putting the American flag over the statue, that was someone told, it didn't feel real.
Yeah, so there's been a lot written and a lot talked about that moment. I can only really say what I know. I was in the Humvee when the lieutenant colonel, who was the battalion commander of that battalion, took the call to go to Ferosh Square to basically secure that area. Initially it wasn't to pull down the statue. I think he made that decision on the spot when he got there. The whole thing took much longer than might have appeared on TV. It actually took a couple of hours because they had to get this tank recovery unit in to pull down and originally there was an Iraqi guy, I think he was a bodybuilder actually, people did stories on him later. He had a sledgehammer and he was trying to smash the bottom of this statue, well really the plinth of the statue, but it was massive. It would have taken weeks to achieve what he was trying to do. And which is really where the Americans kind of stepped in and kind of in some ways helped him out. The moment the flag went onto the face, there were kind of gasps around the square. It is true the square was not full. There were more and more people who came out. I think clearly, there was an invading army now with soldiers wandering around, Marines, and so. Most people, I imagine, were pretty wary of that. Most Iraqis, but then people did come into the square, but it was never full. It was absolutely used as a kind of moment, I guess, to encapsulate that we've been successful from Washington, from the administration's point of view. But it was, but I don't think that it was kind of. I don't think that someone in Hollywood kind of scripted it beforehand. That is my impression. So I think it was much more organic. Was it used for propaganda purposes? Well, clearly. But it wasn't kind of, created in the way that some people have suggested from all that I saw.
Can we talk about the writing and editing process when you were at Time? How it worked. I heard an interview once, not about Time, but about Newsweek, at its kind of high period in the 60s, and how there were huge fights in Vietnam between the correspondents in the field and what was going on back in New York. How heavily edited was that kind of stuff? How collaborative were the stories being pulled together? What was the sort of process?
So I think by the time I joined Time in the mid-1990s, that period had ended, classically at both Newsweek and at Time, through the 60s and 70s, and actually even earlier. There's still the memory at Time of a period of reporting on the Chinese Revolution, and the reporter in China at the time was reporting what he saw. And Henry Luce, who founded and ran Time, felt very strongly that he certainly was kind of anti-communist. So the reports that were appearing in the magazine were very different from what the reporter in China. And there was that tension existed many times over the years, and that was because basically the reporters in the field didn't write. They reported in those days. And would file thousands of words every week to writers in New York, in both cases, for both magazines, and then those writers would take that file, and often files from other reporters around the world, and then often from the library and researchers, and kind of synthesize something in this kind of very, I guess, usually relatively well written, but kind of synthesized view of the world from New York. And I think by the mid-1990s, when I joined, that model was really beginning to break down, partly because of finances. It just wasn't that efficient. And
having two people essentially doing the same piece.
In a way, yeah. And I think also there was like a stronger and stronger push from the field that the reporters should write. I think initially there was some bumpy periods during that changeover because it turns out that some of the reporters couldn't actually write that well. But by the mid-1990s, and certainly now, reporters write their own stories. They are often still, well, when I was at Time, and that was up until 2010, early 2010, they were still pretty heavily edited. So but it had definitely changed by then.
And thank God, because when I read, pieces by, say, Anthony Lloyd or something, so much of the power of those pieces are from feeling him there and writing almost quite poetically about what he's seeing.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that would be lost. Talking of editing as well, at Reuters, the editor's bylines are also included on pieces, which is not common elsewhere. How long has that been going on? And
it certainly predates my arrival here, which was in May 2010. So I'm not sure exactly of how long, but I think the idea is that it gives some sense of ownership, and it also, if you're going to put something out, then having your name on it kind of also is both a credit at some level, but also it imparts a sense of responsibility that you have for the piece.
And also perhaps motivates editors to put more time and effort into a piece because they are feeling like they've got recognition for it.
Sometimes I think that I think at a newswire that we're producing thousands of pieces every day. So some stories certainly are edited much more deeply, and the process is longer. Certainly at the longer end of the kind of spectrum, but a lot of pieces kind of go through the desk pretty quickly.
Can we talk then about your move to Reuters? Like, how did that come about? And then, what was going on in the evolution of Reuters at that time? I think a lot of people came in externally, right, to sort of change the emphasis in some ways. How did the move happen for you? And then what was the kind of brief when you came on board?
Yeah, I think when I came in, so I left Time in, I think, February 2010, came to Reuters in May, and I think there was a growing realization that Reuters had to do more things. It's still kind of, the financial crisis was still going on, and I think that there were various stories in some ways that we weren't telling, that there was a strong desire to tell. And as that realization came about, they did start bringing in more people. There were quite a few people who came in from the Wall Street Journal about a year after I arrived. And so there was a bit of a shift internally. I think it's easy to... It's both easy to overstate the shift because fundamentally, a newswire still covers the world, and that's absolutely what we should do. It's just that the way you do that, I think, has changed. So there are multiple different kind of approaches to covering the world. And I think that over the last 8 or 9 years, and not always easily, but always, I think, with good intention, we're trying to cover the world in a way that really resonates for our clients, for our customers, our thousands of media customers around the world, and then also for our big financial customer, so to keep them happy, basically.
Is it essentially a kind of breadth versus depth argument? Is it that should you be trying to be first on everything, or versus producing these kind of big enterprise pieces? I mean, I remember reading an interview with an editor at the New York Times who said, I know, which is obviously very different, but said with their New York coverage, they made a decision, they weren't going to cover every fire in Brooklyn. They were going to do fewer things in more depth. Is that the heart of the debate for you guys as well?
I think it's the fundamental balancing act that we're always trying to pull off. And so that is not always easy. We do need to cover lots of different things for lots of different people in many parts of the world. It is true that we can't cover every single thing. I think that over the last few years, we've really emphasized breaking news, as in we want to break it. We want to be the first to say this happened, or we discovered, this company was involved in some corporate malfeasance, or this politician is about to quit, or identify trends that maybe no one else has identified, and kind of be the one to call, well, this is happening, and where our reporting informs us in a smart way that this is happening, and I think that is different to, breaking news is different to covering breaking news. We kind of have to do both, But the more we can break news ourselves, the better, because then we become much more indispensable, I think. I think a lot of media companies around the world really are trying as hard as they can to be the indispensable read. Not all of us can be, clearly, and we kind of compete with each other. But we want to provide for our customers and our readers the kind of best, most informative, and also most insightful news from around the world.
Another piece that you wanted to talk about today was a piece you worked on about Starbucks and it's kind of the enigma of its tax avoidance and its accounts, and how its accounts don't match up with what it's been telling investors about success. So why did you want to talk about that piece?
Well, I just think it was a good example. I think that was from about 5 years ago. So a reporter here called Tom Bergen did that piece. He noticed that over the previous 10 or so years, Starbucks had often publicly and with investors and with journalists talked about Britain as one of its best and most fast-growing markets, but that it had reported to the British tax authorities mostly losses over that period. And so there was obviously some sort of disconnect, so he dug into that. The piece really resonated, certainly here, to the point where people would go into Starbucks, and when they asked for your name to give you the coffee, the people would say, pay your tax. And so then I guess the idea was that someone behind the counter would shout out, pay your tax, a minute later or so. I think it was just a good example of the way that we as a newsroom have evolved. I don't think that story would have been done 10 years earlier or even 5 years earlier. So it's the kind of story that I think really is of interest to lots of our customers and readers, obviously. And it then triggered a whole a range of reporting. And we obviously weren't the first to report kind of the tax approach of various big corporations, but there was around that period a real focus on that, and we did a lot of reporting, as did other organizations, other media organizations, and I think investigating and identifying things like that is of huge value to readers, because it just kind of exposes parts of the world that are otherwise covered.
And what I thought was interesting with that was it was sourced from earnings calls, right? That which are public documents, right? So it was kind of in the public domain, but it was, someone had to go in there, and it was a sort of open secret in some ways.
Hiding in plain sight, as an editor of ours used to say. Absolutely. Yeah. I think there are lots of stories like that. And actually that's where data journalism is really useful, where sometimes the story is lost because it's kind of lost in a mass of data or in a mass of information that's difficult to filter or difficult to decipher, in some way difficult to read. So journalists who can see that and then spot the story or the potential story, are hugely valuable. So
did the journalist come across that? Was he just kind of digging around and that's how the story came about? Or
yes, more or less. Yeah, he exactly.
So he hadn't been told to kind of investigate?
No.
And what about the broader kind of business focus of your coverage? So I was saying off air that I was a stringer for Reuters for 2 years in West Africa. And one thing that I found very interesting doing that was, I think a lot of people went into that work because they wanted to be a foreign correspondent. They had a kind of, it was romantic and it was exciting. And but the organization, and it was clear, there was this focus, real focus on business. And I was sometimes, slightly skeptical of this, thinking like, no one really like grew up being really interested in Ivorian coffee futures or something like that. But that was, what the organization focused. I mean, how broadly do you draw the lines of what is a business story?
You're absolutely right. We do both, and I mentioned earlier that we kind of in some ways on one side compete with the AP and on the other side compete with Bloomberg, which is obviously focused a lot more on the financial and business type stories. Well, first of all, I think those stories, we have a big customer and a lot of our revenue comes from that, and we absolutely need to cover the world in that way. And there's it's really useful for lots of people. I also think that often the best way to tell the story of a country is through a business story. Telling the story of France, say, through luxury goods is in some ways just as revelatory as digging directly into its politics. The way that kind of, I guess, merger of art and commerce in a luxury goods firm happens, and the personalities and the finances of companies will tell you in many ways as much about how France works as any other type of story. So I think that we take a fairly broad view of where the line is between a business story and a more general story, and in any case, it's a bit of a blurred line because business stories, we think, can be general stories as well. There are business stories or kind of information that we need to get out to clients that can be presented in charts or in tables or just as data points, that is also incredibly useful, that doesn't have to be kind of high journalism. And that's also really, really important.
And so what's the business model? Again, this is something I never, when I was at the very far end in the field, I never quite understood. Like, there are subscribers, but they're paying... Because I also never understood that you would write a piece of Reuters and it would be on open access online. But what is the subscription product? Like, what are people paying for? Where does that I never quite understood, but I'd be interested to know how it works.
There's a gap between when it gets to all of our clients and when it appears online for us. And essentially, if you're a subscriber, you're paying in some ways for that delay. For our financial client, we obviously the seconds count there. If we beat Bloomberg on the news of a rate rise, a central bank somewhere announcing a rate rise, even if we beat Bloomberg by a few seconds, then that is incredibly valuable for all those people who subscribe to Reuters in the markets. So that's a bit of an arms race. And when I say people, often nowadays it's not people, it's computers. So a lot of trading companies will have algorithms that are reading our news and our kind of alerts, our snaps that go out, and then trading off of those. So it's often kind of computer to computer, incredibly. And then on the other side, all our media customers around the world, they use us for, I think, covering parts of the world that they can't be, because if, say, the New York Times wants to have a full report of the world, or however much of a report of the world that they want, they rely on us for a lot of stuff. And we do have a website, a consumer website, but the pieces that appear there's a delay. So our customers get it first.
So how many reporters do you have reporting into you at a given time?
Into me at the moment, I've just shifted job, so I'm in a slightly different job. So I actually don't have I don't have lots and lots of direct reporters reporting into me now. I'm looking after the newsroom, so that's a pretty broad kind of mandate. So the reporters generally, we have nearly 2,500 journalists around the world, and they broadly, most of them report into three people. So our global head of visuals, our head of kind of news reporting and planning, and then our head of news production and publishing, basically. So those three people, most of the newsroom kind of report up to those three people, and then I take a broader look at across those three at bureaus and training and bringing new talent in, retaining talent.
What's the turnover like for talent and for reporters? Do you tend to work with the same ones for many years?
There are a lot of people who have been at Reuters for a really, really long time. And the answer is really it depends on what part of the world you're talking about. So it's much higher in some parts. It's higher in Asia. I think just the economies of Asia tend generally in the jobs market to have a kind of higher turnover rate. So it's lower in Europe.
Can we talk about the big Iran investigation that you did? So I don't want to mispronounce the name of it, but this organization in Iran that was holding enormous amounts of property. And what I thought was interesting with that was, I think, as you mentioned, like an example of the sort of sheer reporting horsepower that you can bring to something. But I also thought it was interesting, this is a huge, three-parter, very big story about, a relatively niche subject, perhaps one could say that. And I'm thinking, what were the decisions that were made in terms of like, yes, we're going to invest a lot of time into it, the challenges of pulling it together, and then what kind of impact did that make?
So yeah, that was a story or a series of stories. It's 6 years ago now. It was when I was working on the kind of investigative desk in this part of the world, and it was done by 3 or 4 reporters. Interestingly, it was all reported from outside of Iran, which obviously has its own challenge, although also gives a certain level of freedom as well. And it was an investigation into a kind of financial empire that the supreme leader of Iran had built, partly on the back of property seizures. I think it was just one of those really compelling stories. So it was certainly not. I don't think it was niche necessarily. I think it said a lot about Iran, and it was it was incredibly revelatory. No one had really looked at this before. We identified a kind of a huge chunk of wealth that he controlled, and obviously it said a lot about the way the supreme leader asserts power and the way Iran works. So we thought that it was a really interesting subject that lots of readers would be interested in, and I think the impact, it got various people in I think in the U.S. government interested in how it worked. Certainly, in terms of sanctions, it was looked at, but I think with something like that, it's not necessarily going to bring down a government or anything like that. But
I don't think we've said its name yet, have we?
So it's Satad is the name
yeah.
of the name of the organization. I mean, it's still kind of the most comprehensive look at that organization. I don't think anyone else has really dug into it.
What was the seed of that investigation?
One of our investigative reporters had got some documents, and that's where it began. But it took months of reporting. It was not an easy story to report, and I was one of the editors on it.
And can we talk a little bit about your role as global managing editor? So when did you come into that role?
I really started in about 2 months ago.
So could you describe a typical day, for instance? What does it entail? Or is no 2 days?
There's no, yeah, it's really different, and because I'm just beginning the role, I think that I'm still working out how exactly it will work. But I'm involved a lot in thinking kind of longer term strategy around hiring, where we want to focus, if we want to prioritize certain parts of our coverage. I work closely with the main person driving news coverage, because it obviously has to align with what she wants. And this has all kind of come about because we've essentially over the last 9 or 10 months restructured the newsroom and the way we manage that. And we mostly in the past, our chief organizing principle in some ways was geographic, so we kind of divided the world into 3. And in some ways, those 3 newsrooms were kind of operating almost somewhat independently of each other. The idea here is that we have moved to a chief organizing principle where we have kind of the news gathering and then the news production, and it's more global. So we're trying to operate more globally.
Can we talk again about kind of writing and editing questions? So with these longer things, what I found interesting with that was, Reuters has this very crisp style for breaking news of relatively short paragraphs, quite punchy, a kind of house style. And how is that produced when you have people perhaps at the far end who are not necessarily native English speakers or things like that? But also when it comes to a more enterprise-led story like this, how, that's 6,000 words, something it's big. How do you go about kind of working out the style and the way from a writing and editing perspective you want to put this stuff together?
I think just different stories require different approaches, and I think the kind of classic inverted pyramid, which works really well for breaking news. It's
Could you explain what that is? For people
Yeah,
who may
sorry,
not know?
inverted pyramid. So that's basically the most important the most important news at the top, and then kind of, I guess, progressively more and more detailed down certain paths as you go down. So the president today said X. That's the news. And then you provide a bit of context, and then you, as the story progresses, you add more and more detail. But really, what you want to know is the news at the top. And I think for breaking news, still, that's an incredibly useful way to relay information. It's not the only way, and I think that one of our challenges, in some ways, partly because a lot of our clients are doing news in different ways, is working out how we can help them to do that experimentation in ways that they're going to be happy with. Should we provide clients information not in story format, but maybe just in a series of bullet points? Is that the best way for them to take it in? Maybe sometimes the answer is yes. Maybe sometimes they want the perfectly written story that they can put up on their digital website to before they. But so that allowing them to go out and kind of do a piece that's related, but certainly angled in a different way. So I think that there's a lot of kind of experimentation at the moment, which is exciting.
As managing editor, you're going to have a lot more of a personal, almost sort of a slight kind of HR role with a lot of journalists. People come to the managing editor with personal issues and with problems to do with their job, and it can be, I suppose, quite heavy with some of the issues that you have to deal with. What have you noticed a kind of shift in what these issues are for journalists in 2019, particularly with what's been happening in the media landscape?
It's a really interesting question. Yeah, I think that there are, in certain parts of the world, I think that being a journalist has become more challenging. I think the way that we approached it is to say, well, first of all, to recognize that we've always faced some of those challenges. So if we're reporting in very challenging places in the world, we have a long history of doing that day in, day out, and the way we deal with that is just to report. We are absolutely committed to being independent, free from bias. We give people fair, all opportunity to have fair comment. And we do that. We practice that kind of old-fashioned journalism in some ways around the world, day in, day out, so that when world leaders have kind of popped up in places and challenged journalism and journalists in ways that you wouldn't expect normally in that country. I think that we've kind of taken the approach, well, hang on, we've done this in lots of places around the world for years, if not decades. So I think that one of the big challenges, you're right, is just, and with social media, I think journalists have become in some ways a little more exposed. And we need to be really mindful of that. We have a lot of attention, especially over the last few years, to kind of mental health issues, to the well-being of our journalists. We have a peer program which allows, which basically, if someone's feeling really stressed, it was originally kind of set up in part because for journalists who are covering wars and conflicts, but it can be, covering a central bank can be very stressful if you're having to snap and beat Bloomberg by 3 seconds. So it allowed someone to have someone who was trained maybe for a couple of days in being almost a bit like a counselor, not formally, but unofficially, and just someone to talk to within the newsroom because they understand other journalists really well. We also have an outside organization that does stress and counseling, trauma counseling for us. We have a mental health champion. So we've paid a lot of attention to that. I would also say, to answer your question, what are the kind of issues that people come to? I think that a lot of reporters, and particularly I think millennials and Generation Z or Z in America, are really concerned more to a greater degree about things like maternity leave cover, opportunities to move around, and kind of much more actively kind of demanding of those things in a way that probably previous generations weren't. So that's an interesting challenge for any company, frankly, and in particular for a media organization where, its budgets are always tight, and so I think that a lot of my work over the next couple of years will be around issues that really concern a lot of our younger reporters in particular.
Could you talk about where your reporters were imprisoned? Was it in Burma that there were?
In Myanmar, there we had two reporters, Walon and Chao Sa'u, who were arrested in late 2017, and for some reporting that they were doing, we were doing a lot of reporting on the Rohingya and the kind of oppression and in some cases violent oppression of Rohingya, and we had looked at a village where a group of men had been killed essentially, and our reporters were arrested and imprisoned and only got out earlier this year.
And how does the structure of your news gathering organisation split between kind of international staffers, local staffers, and stringers? What is the breakdown?
We're a really global organisation. We have lots of one of our great strengths, I think, are our local reporters around the world, and that could be both in Paris and it could be in Myanmar. So we have a real mix. I think that traditionally the model, I guess, was like for many media organizations that in the case of Reuters, partly because it has a long history in London, that Brits would go out into the world and then reporters would be kind of come from both local sources and often from the UK. Now we're much more, I think, mixed. We're listed in Toronto and New York, so we have a massive newsroom in New York. I think that we and that model is really breaking down in a good way. I think we're a lot more varied, and we really want our bureau chiefs and our senior most reporters to come from all around the world.
Where do your young reporters tend to want to go now?
I think that it's not so much where they want to go. I mean, there's a lot obviously interested in places like China, but I think it's not where it's kind of what beats they want to cover. I think things like cyber are really kind of sexy for a lot of reporters, but we cover, because we're so big, we cover so many different subjects that and so many parts of the world that I think reporters are interested in lots of different parts. At the moment, I mean, obviously Brexit has kind of here in London kept us enthralled, and we see our role really to be explaining that often quite arcane kind of parliamentary procedures to the world. In a sense, we while at some level we compete and provide for British media organisations, we're really writing for a global audience, and so explaining Brexit to people is interesting. At various points, I think that people have kind of got a bit tired of it. But I know my mother in Australia still says, "Oh, I saw what happened the other day," and so people are still aware of it and watching. She's got some distance from it, right?
So we always ask about money on the podcast, and again, pursuant of that kind of previous question, I remember when I was in Africa, you were conscious that there was a kind of caste divide as a stringer and a staffer between what people were paid and also between what local and international staff were paid. And I was also conscious, not just with Reuters, but with news organisations in general, that often when you have kind of freelance people in potentially difficult parts of the world, there's a question of, are they insured? How's that covered? And Reuters did pay for my insurance when I was there. But how do you negotiate that piece in terms of, what burden of duty of care do you have for people who are at different arm's length from your organisation?
I think that anyone who works for us regularly, we absolutely have a duty of care for. I think that, and we really pride ourselves on our hostile environment training, and that is open to our freelancers as well. We do a series of training courses around the world every year in lots of different parts. And we often have freelancers who work regularly for us in those. And then, obviously in terms of pay, we're in something like 150 countries. We tend to operate as most international organizations do, looking at the local market really. So that's the way we operate.
What do you find the most kind of stressful, maybe hair-raising part of your job when you're thinking about everything that you have to look after? Is it, for instance, feeling responsible for so many people in quite dangerous situations all the time? Is it budget and going forward and adapting to the changing newspaper models and news models? Or is it, personal issues within the newsroom, or is it legal issues to do with certain stories?
I think it's a mix of all those things. I think that whenever there is a conflict, we're all really, really aware of the dangers.
What's kind of been the diciest situation for you? Well, not personally, but when thinking about responsibility.
I mean, I've only really been in this job a couple of months, so I previously was running Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and obviously over the last few years, Syria has been incredibly challenging in many ways as a place to report. I think when ISIS was in northern Iraq, or in Iraq, that was really challenging as well. I think we're really aware of how we handle our reporting teams and our people in those situations. We have security advisors with us with those teams. We kind of regularly check in. For the last few years, I've been on a weekly call, a security call, where we discuss all the issues that we face. So we're really aware of that. I think we have a pretty good protocol, and we're constantly kind of looking at it and thinking about how we can improve it. I think that at the same time, there is a lot of change in any media organization. There's lots and lots of change, and I am really aware that change is often stressful for our people and our reporters, and I'm always kind of happy to talk to reporters. In fact, I was just talking to a couple of people yesterday, a couple of editors about some recent changes and where that's working and where there are still challenges. And I think that constant kind of needing, in some ways, as an organization, to remain viable and to remain really successful, which we are. You constantly have to think about change and how you're going to adapt, but you want to do it in a way that sets you up for success and a continued success, but also makes your people happy. Change in itself is often stressful, so managing that and managing through that it can be really challenging, I think.
There's a final thing, for yourself, becoming a manager, it's a very different, or a leader really. That's very different from being a reporter. And I think often, news organizations have this thing where people will be promoted because they're good journalists and then they're managing teams, and that's a very different role. How did you find that transition, and is there training available for that kind of thing?
Yeah, we get some training, and we also train bureau chiefs. We have kind of regular newsroom training that some of our new leaders and managers can come to a few times a year. I think it is challenging. I really love to think that I'm a journalist who manages rather than a manager who sometime in the distant past was a journalist, because I think it's important to kind of stay rooted in the journalism, and that's why we're here. That's why I got into this business. And so for myself, I mean, speaking really selfishly, I guess that is a source of energy to engage with the journalism. But I think then the other way to think of it is that when you're managing, you're kind of creating the grounds, the environment in which good journalism can flourish. And so that's also important.
Simon, thank you very much for talking to us today. That's been fascinating. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Hello, it's us again with an update from our lives. Ellie off air has just said she has nothing to say in her
I
outro.
really want a coffee. How are you?
I mean, I'm okay. I've been working on some more Alpine themed stories.
Oh, shut up, Simon.
Which is great. And I've been...
You must have some really nice outerwear.
And thermal base layers and mid layers as well.
For Outside magazine. Wait, what did I call it? Outdoor
magazine. Yeah. So yeah, I've been doing that. I've been wrapping up my paternity cover magazine stuff and the continued shenanigans of my book. And yeah, so all good.
You're getting lots of fan mail about that.
I have, yeah. Which
are you replying to everyone?
You
must.
Yeah, graciously.
Any horrible ones?
No.
None from the army?
No, they've been very quiet. So
classic.
I think the reason this is slightly stilted is that we did this interview very early in the morning. Ellie hasn't had a coffee yet. You have to say something.
Who are you calling stilted? I'm asking you lots of questions.
It's part of your fascination to probe me open as a podcast host.
What am I doing? Well, I am going to the Ned's Halloween party tomorrow night.
Anyway, so that's us. This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Eleanor Halls.
Our producer is Nicola Keane. Our graphic design is by James Edgar. And our score is by Jess Danheiser.
Please do rate, review and subscribe on iTunes, and do find us on social media. We're on Take Notes Always on Twitter and Always Take Notes on Instagram and Facebook.
And if you enjoyed the show, do think about supporting us on Patreon, where we are at Always Take Notes.
Bye.